Sergeant Miles Calder looked at the black woman standing in front of him and let out a short laugh when she set down an envelope stamped by a federal court. He never asked her name, he never checked her badge. He tore the sealed warrant in half and let the pieces fall to the floor. "You think a couple of fake stamps are going to scare me?" Talia Vance bent down, picked up the torn paper, and spoke calmly into the button of her jacket. "The document has been compromised." 10 seconds later, the glass doors rattled. Dozens of United States Marshals poured into the station and locked it down. If you want to watch arrogance collapse in front of real justice, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. Talia Vance walked into the Briar Ridge police station at 8:47 in the morning, and nothing about her appearance suggested the storm she carried with her. She wore a plain dark jacket over a gray sweater, flat shoes built for standing on her feet for hours, and carried a small leather case in one hand. In the other hand, she held a thick manila envelope, its flap sealed with the raised stamp of a federal court, the kind of seal that most people in that building had never actually seen up close. Outside, along every street feeding into the block, unmarked vehicles had already taken their positions in silence, engines off, windows cracked just enough for the men and women inside to hear the city breathing around them. A tactical team led by a man named Owen Reddick sat in the lead vehicle, listening through a small microphone hidden beneath the collar of her jacket, waiting for a single phrase that would tell them everything had changed. The plan had been debated for weeks before that morning, argued over conference tables and secure phone lines until everyone agreed on the safest possible sequence. Talia would walk in alone first, request a private meeting with the chief of police, and give the leadership of the station one final chance to cooperate before the rest of the operation began. It was designed to lower the odds of a violent confrontation between two armed agencies operating under the same roof, and it was designed to protect the officers who had nothing to do with what was coming. The patrol officers and desk clerks who had simply shown up for another ordinary shift. If the chief refused to cooperate, or tried to destroy evidence the moment he understood who she really was, the federal team stationed outside would move in immediately, without hesitation and without warning shots. Miles Calder noticed her the second she crossed the threshold, and his expression soured before she had even reached the counter. He did not ask what she needed or offer the kind of professional courtesy that training manuals promised every visitor. He told her to step aside and make room for someone with real business at the station, waving a hand toward the door as though she might simply turn around and leave. When Talia calmly explained that she needed to speak with the chief regarding a federal court order, Calder looked her plain clothing up and down and laughed out loud, the sound carrying across the lobby and drawing a few curious glances from the officers milling near the coffee station. He assumed, instantly and without a shred of doubt, that she was some kind of disgruntled complainant trying to intimidate the department with forged paperwork bought off a website somewhere. She held out her badge without raising her voice and asked him to verify the identification number through the department's proper verification channel, the same procedure every officer in the country was trained to follow. He barely glanced at the medal in her palm before shoving it back across the counter, telling her flatly that he had dealt with plenty of people pretending to be federal agents before, and that a badge alone proved nothing in a world where anyone could buy a costume. Behind the frosted glass partition at the back of the lobby, Talia caught the faint outline of an employee quietly closing the door that led toward the server hallway, moving with the particular haste of someone who had just been given an urgent instruction. In that instant, watching the reflection ripple across the glass, she understood with total clarity that news of the investigation might already have leaked before she had ever walked through the front door that morning. 18 months earlier, a string of complaints had begun arriving at the county courthouse, each one describing the same pattern in different words. Residents claimed that cash and property seized during arrests routinely vanished before ever reaching a courtroom, disappearing somewhere between the evidence locker and the judge's bench. Every file connected to those seizures carried a complete and orderly signature trail, which was precisely why earlier internal audits had turned up nothing suspicious, since paperwork that looks flawless rarely invites a second glance. A records clerk named Julian Crow, a quiet man who had worked in that basement archive for nearly 2 decades, noticed something the auditors before him had missed entirely. The same evidence codes kept resurfacing under slightly different descriptions, as though items were being rewritten weeks after they had already been logged and photographed. An expensive watch might be entered into the system on a Tuesday morning and then quietly reclassified as an item of no significant value by Tuesday afternoon, with no explanation ever attached to the sudden change in status. Julian said nothing to anyone inside the building. He had a wife and 2 grown children who depended on his pension, and he understood exactly what could happen to a man who accused his own department of theft without absolute proof in hand. Instead, over the course of several careful weeks, he secretly copied the department's data tables onto a small drive he kept hidden in his jacket pocket, working late in the archive after everyone else had gone home for the night, and mailed the material anonymously to the federal prosecutor's office downtown without ever including a return address. The files eventually landed on the desk of a woman named Evelyn Hartwell, a federal prosecutor known throughout the office for reading every page of every file before making a single phone call, a habit that had earned her a reputation for being slow but nearly impossible to outmaneuver in court. She recognized the pattern immediately, circling the same reclassified evidence codes Julian himself had flagged, and when several witnesses connected to the case abruptly vanished after threatening to speak up publicly, she requested direct assistance from the United States Marshals Service, arguing forcefully that local law enforcement could no longer be trusted to investigate itself from the inside. Talia was placed in command of the resulting task force, and the deeper she dug into the department's records, the further the corruption seemed to spread. Chief Nolan Whitlock had not simply been skimming cash from the evidence room over the years. He had been altering the timestamps on surveillance footage, fabricating justification for searches that never should have happened, and pressuring people under arrest into signing away their property rights before they ever had the pants to speak with an attorney. A private company called Ashford Sentinel Technologies supplied the department's entire surveillance infrastructure, and buried inside their proprietary software was a hidden feature that allowed a system administrator to delete footage permanently without leaving a single trace in the normal user interface. In exchange for that quiet cooperation, Sebastian Ashford's company kept winning the city's largest surveillance contracts year after year, worth tens of millions of dollars, while competing bids from other vendors mysteriously fell apart before they ever reached a final vote. Talia refused to move too quickly, no matter how much pressure came from above to close the case fast. She understood that Whitlock had powerful friends scattered across City Hall and an expensive legal team on permanent retainer, and she knew that without the original servers, the physical evidence logbooks, and documented proof of every deletion order, he would simply blame everything on the officers beneath him and walk away with his pension intact. Twice during those long months, her own supervisors asked why the case was taking so long, and twice she gave the same answer, explaining that a rushed indictment against a man with Whitlock's connections would collapse the first time a defense attorney raised a single procedural objection. She had watched cases like this one fall apart before, not because the evidence was weak, but because someone moved too fast and left a gap large enough for an entire jury to walk through. She kept a small notebook of her own throughout the investigation, separate from the official case file, where she recorded every doubt, every inconsistency, and every question that still needed an answer before she would be willing to sign off on a single arrest. After months of patient, methodical work, Evelyn finally secured a sweeping federal warrant, the server room, Whitlock's private office, and every financial account tied to Ashford Sentinel Technologies. The presiding judge insisted the entire order remain sealed until the exact moment of execution, a precaution meant to prevent anyone inside the department from destroying evidence the instant they caught wind of what was coming. Evelyn personally carried the sealed original to a secure vault, rather than trusting it to any digital system that Whitlock's department might somehow be able to reach, a decision that would later prove far more important than anyone realized on that quiet afternoon. In the end, only 7 people on the entire planet knew the precise hour the raid would begin, and standing at that counter listening to Calder's laughter, Talia was beginning to suspect that one of those 7 had already talked. Back at the front counter, Calder kept mocking her in front of several other officers who had drifted closer to watch the spectacle unfold, asking whether she had purchased her badge online or borrowed it from the set of some cheap television production. A few of the younger officers standing near the break room looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting their weight and glancing toward the floor, but none of them dared to say a single word in her defense. Talia did not raise her voice or argue back. She asked him again, evenly and without a trace of frustration in her tone, to simply call the Federal Marshal's office and verify her identity through the official line. He refused outright, leaning forward over the counter and telling her that inside this building, he was the one who decided who got to walk through the door and who got turned away. She placed the sealed envelope down on the counter between them and warned him one final time that the document inside was certified by a federal court and that destroying it could constitute a serious act of obstruction of justice under federal law. The word obstruction seemed to strike a nerve somewhere deep inside him, and his face flushed red as he accused her of threatening a sworn officer inside his own station, his own house, in front of his own people. Down the far hallway, Chief Whitlock appeared in the doorway of his office but did not step forward to intervene. He caught Calder's eye and gave him a small, deliberate signal, a slight tilt of the head, instructing him without a single spoken word to keep her occupied at that counter for as long as humanly possible. Calder picked up the envelope, tore the wax seal in half with a sharp, satisfied motion, and let the pieces flutter down onto the tile floor between them, declaring loudly that a single sheet of paper could not give orders to the Briar Ridge Police Department. One young officer near the filing cabinets recognized the authentic court stamp pressed into the paper and started to speak up, taking a half step forward, but Lieutenant Brett Harlan snapped at him sharply to stay quiet and mind his own business. Through the faint reflection cast across the glass partition, Talia watched Whitlock hand a cell phone to a nervous-looking technician and gesture with 2 fingers toward the direction of the server room, the movement quick and practiced, the kind of gesture that had clearly been rehearsed long before this particular morning. She knelt down slowly and gathered the torn pieces of paper from the floor, careful to preserve the fingerprints pressed into the fibers and the exact pattern of the tear, treating the ruined document as evidence rather than simply discarding it in frustration. Then she spoke quietly into the small button microphone fastened to the collar of her jacket. The document has been compromised. Initiate lockdown. Calder assumed she was bluffing, some desperate last attempt to save face after being humiliated in front of an audience, and he laughed even harder, louder now, loud enough that a few more officers turned to look. Then the electronic locks on both sets of front doors clicked into place with a heavy mechanical finality, and the smile drained slowly from his face as understanding began to creep in. Both sets of doors opened at once, sliding apart with a hydraulic hiss that seemed to suck the air out of the lobby. Owen Reddick led the first wave of marshals through the front entrance in a tight, disciplined formation, while other teams simultaneously secured the rear exit, the parking lot, the weapons locker, and the narrow stairwell leading down to the basement archives. No one raised a weapon. No one fired a single shot. Owen repeated the same instructions over and over as he moved through the room, telling everyone to keep their hands visible and comply fully with the orders of the court, his voice calm and steady even as chaos rippled through the officers around him. A technical team moved swiftly to cut off remote access to every server in the building while deliberately leaving the power running, careful not to lose a single byte of data in the process, and the department-issued phones belonging to everyone named in the warrant were collected and sealed on the spot, dropped into individually labeled evidence bags right where their owners stood. Calder, still trying to process what was happening around him, demanded that Talia be arrested immediately for impersonating a federal officer, jabbing a finger in her direction as though volume alone might reverse the last 30 seconds. Owen walked directly past him without breaking stride, offered Talia a crisp, formal salute, and addressed her clearly as Supervisory Deputy Vance in front of the entire stunned lobby. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that seems to press against the walls. Talia reached into her leather case and produced a second certified copy of the warrant, explaining in a level voice that the original remained safely on file with the court, and that a digital copy had already been verified and time-stamped hours before she ever set foot inside the building, meaning Calder's decision to tear the paper copy had accomplished absolutely nothing in a legal sense. If anything, his own reckless actions had just become direct, recorded evidence of destroying a federal document and obstructing the lawful execution of a signed court order. Whitlock finally stepped forward from the hallway, attempting to reshape the entire scene into a simple misunderstanding between overzealous colleagues, insisting loudly that Calder had only been protecting the station from a stranger who refused to properly identify herself. Talia calmly played back a short segment of audio from her hidden microphone, the recording capturing Calder's own voice refusing to call the official verification line and openly dismissing her badge as worthless. Whitlock shifted tactics immediately, his expression hardening into something colder, announcing that Calder had clearly acted entirely on his own initiative and would be suspended from duty effective that very moment. Calder turned slowly to look at the man he had served loyally for years, realizing for the first time with a sickening drop in his stomach that Whitlock was fully prepared to abandon him without a second thought. Talia announced to the entire room that no one would be permitted to leave the building until the federal team had confirmed the identity, assigned role, and data access level of every single person currently present. Beneath his desk, out of sight, Whitlock quietly pressed an emergency alert button he had installed himself years earlier, but the signal never reached City Dispatch. It appeared instead directly on the monitoring screens carried by the federal team already standing in his own lobby. Whitlock demanded the right to call the mayor, the city prosecutor, and his personal defense attorney all at once, reminding everyone within earshot that he had served this department for more than 30 years and maintained close relationships with powerful people scattered across the entire region. Talia allowed him to contact his lawyer without objection, but explained clearly that any device falling within the scope of the warrant, including his personal cell phone, would first need to be examined and logged by the technical team before it could be used for outgoing calls. Whitlock reached a city council member he had known for over a decade and asked bluntly for pressure to be applied against the federal office, but the call produced absolutely nothing, since Evelyn Hartwell had already formally notified city leadership the moment the operation began that morning, closing off that particular avenue before Whitlock even thought to try it. Talia read aloud, slowly and clearly, each area of the building covered by the warrant. The evidence room, the command office, the entire camera system, a backup data storage room, and Whitlock's personal safe. When she mentioned the backup storage room specifically, Brett Harlan visibly lost his composure, insisting loudly that no such room existed anywhere in the building, that she must be working from bad information. Julian Crow stepped forward from where he had been standing quietly near the archive shelves and pointed toward a section of false wall hidden behind an old, dust-covered records cabinet that nobody had moved in years. Whitlock immediately spun toward Julian and accused him of stealing confidential department information, his voice sharp with real fear now bleeding through the composure. Talia replied calmly that Julian was already under federal witness protection, and that any threat directed at him would be treated as a separate criminal matter entirely. Behind the false wall, hidden in a space no larger than a closet, the technical team discovered several external hard drives, a collection of cell phones that had clearly been confiscated during arrests but never properly logged into any official file, and dozens of thick envelopes stuffed with cash bound together with rubber bands. A photographer from the forensic unit documented every inch of the space before a single item was touched, numbering each envelope and drive with small yellow tags, while 2 agents stood at the entrance recording the process on video, a level of care that would later make it impossible for any defense attorney to argue the evidence had been mishandled. Tucked behind a loose panel near the floor, one agent found a small fireproof box containing property deeds and a set of keys that did not match any vehicle registered to Whitlock under his own name, a discovery that would eventually lead investigators to a second, unregistered property nobody at the department had known existed. Calder tried desperately to claim he knew absolutely nothing about the hidden room, but Whitlock, without a flicker of hesitation, told the entire lobby coldly that Calder had regular access to the evidence room and could very well be the person responsible for everything they were now discovering. Calder understood in that exact moment, watching Whitlock's face remain perfectly composed, that he was being turned into a convenient scapegoat right in front of an audience of his own colleagues. Talia made no promise to protect him from what was coming. She said only, in a measured and unhurried voice, that the truth would ultimately be determined by evidence, and by evidence alone, not by the word of whoever happened to hold the highest rank in the room that morning. On one of the recovered hard drives, buried 3 folders deep, the technical team found a directory labeled with Whitlock's own initials, a small detail that would soon become very important. Forensic specialists spent the following hours carefully copying the recovered data under the direct supervision of the city attorney and a representative sent by the police union, a deliberate precaution meant to prevent any future accusation of federal tampering. Inside Whitlock's private folder was a detailed list of high-value seizures stretching back nearly 6 years. Each entry color-coded to indicate exactly how the proceeds had been divided among Whitlock, Harlan, and several other officers whose names had not yet surfaced. A long chain of emails revealed that Sebastian Ashford had personally granted the department system a hidden administrator account, allowing his own technical staff to delete footage remotely under the innocent-sounding label of routine system maintenance. In exchange for that quiet arrangement, Whitlock had steered the city's most recent camera installation contract directly to Ashford Sentinel Technologies, bypassing 2 competing bids that had actually offered better pricing and equipment. Talia discovered that the overwhelming majority of deleted footage was tied directly to searches that lacked any clear or legitimate justification under the law, and small fragments still lingering in temporary memory proved conclusively that the official written reports had been quietly rewritten after the fact to match a story that never actually happened. Harlan tried repeatedly to shift the blame onto a technician who had already left the department months earlier, but the system access logs showed his own personal badge swiping in at the exact moments the footage had disappeared, a detail he had apparently forgotten to account for when he built his story on the spot. When confronted with the timestamps directly, he grew visibly agitated, pacing the small interview room and insisting that everyone in the department had known about the arrangement in one way or another, as though shared silence could somehow dilute individual guilt. Evelyn reminded him quietly that the law rarely saw it that way, and that his best chance of leniency depended entirely on how quickly he decided to stop protecting the people above him. During the growing chaos, a nervous technician attempted to physically remove a hard drive from a secondary server before it could be examined, and Owen stopped him just in time, before the device could be damaged or wiped clean. Under questioning, the technician finally admitted that Whitlock had personally ordered the immediate deletion of what he casually referred to as the red files, issuing that order the very instant Talia first stepped through the front entrance, since Whitlock had already spotted her face on the entrance camera feed and understood immediately why she had come, which was the real and only reason he had signaled Calder to keep her occupied and distracted at the front counter. The recording captured by Talia's hidden microphone had also picked up a fragment of Whitlock's voice, low and urgent, whispering an order to Harlan to clean out the lower floor before anyone else arrived. This particular detail mattered more than it first appeared, because it proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the destruction of evidence had actually begun the moment Whitlock recognized federal presence on his security monitors. Not only after the warrant had been formally announced and read aloud in the lobby. Calder began cooperating fully at that point, visibly shaken, admitting that Whitlock had messaged him privately through the department's internal system with clear instructions to rattle the woman at the counter or, failing that, to force her to leave the building entirely before anyone else noticed her presence. Talia revealed, almost as an afterthought, that before she had ever walked through those front doors that morning, she had already forwarded a complete facial recognition profile of Whitlock to the surveillance team stationed outside, and had preserved a full, time-stamped record of every single order he issued from that point forward. Whitlock's attorney moved fast once news of the raid began spreading, releasing a carefully worded statement to local reporters accusing the federal government of using excessive force to publicly humiliate a functioning police department in front of the entire community. A short video clip showing armed marshals entering the building through the front doors began circulating almost immediately, conveniently missing the earlier footage of Calder tearing the warrant apart and dropping it on the floor. Whitlock genuinely believed that public pressure and outrage would force Talia's team to withdraw before the search could ever be completed, buying him enough time to salvage whatever remained of his position. Talia refused entirely to engage with the noise building outside, understanding that a public argument would accomplish nothing but delay. She and Evelyn instead released a brief, carefully worded statement confirming only that the operation was being carried out under a valid and fully executed court order, nothing more and nothing less. A handful of local commentators picked up the story within hours, framing it as government overreach against a respected community institution, and for a brief while the narrative outside the building threatened to outrun the facts inside it. A retired judge who had known Whitlock for decades went on the radio to vouch for his character, describing him as a dedicated public servant who had spent 30 years protecting the very community now being told he had betrayed it. Evelyn warned Talia that public opinion could still shape how quickly the case moved through the courts, even if it had no bearing on the strength of the underlying evidence, and the two of them agreed to let the facts speak for themselves rather than fight a battle of sound bites they were never going to win on volume alone. Talia had seen this pattern before in other investigations, the reflexive instinct of a community to defend a familiar face over an unfamiliar accusation, and she understood that patience, not persuasion, would eventually settle the argument. Inside the building, Talia turned her full attention to reviewing the complete list of everyone who had accessed the evidence room over the past several years, cross-referencing names against shift schedules and badge swipe records. She discovered that a disturbing number of young officers had been quietly pressured into signing off on shifts they had never actually worked, their signatures forged onto timesheets they had never seen. Several of them, once separated from Harlan and questioned individually, began admitting that he routinely threatened transfers or outright termination against anyone foolish enough to ask too many questions about missing property. Julian handed Talia an old worn notebook where he had personally and meticulously tracked every single instance of altered records over the years, and the dates recorded inside lined up exactly with wire transfers moving quietly from Ashford Sentinel Technologies into a charitable foundation that Whitlock personally controlled behind the scenes. Sebastian Ashford, unaware that his phone had already been placed under federal surveillance days earlier, called Whitlock directly and told him to keep quiet no matter what happened, promising to send a private plane to get him out of the country before anything worse unfolded. He spoke the way men in his position usually spoke when they believed money could still solve any problem, casually mentioning a property overseas where Whitlock could wait out the investigation in comfort until things quieted down. Talia immediately requested an expanded arrest order citing a clear and documented flight risk, and the request was approved within the hour by a judge who had already reviewed enough of the case file to understand the urgency. Ashford was intercepted at a small regional airport before his plane ever left the runway, still holding a garment bag over one arm, visibly stunned to find federal agents waiting at the base of the stairs instead of a flight crew. Once he learned that Whitlock had already prepared internal paperwork designed to place the entire blame squarely on his shoulders, painting him as the sole architect of the deletion scheme, he abandoned his loyalty without much hesitation and agreed to cooperate fully with investigators in exchange for a more favorable outcome. Ashford handed over a damning recording in which Whitlock could clearly be heard giving an explicit order to tear apart any paperwork that woman tried to bring into the building, a phrase that would echo throughout the rest of the case and eventually appear in nearly every news account written about it afterward. Whitlock was eventually brought into a small conference room under the direct watch of Talia, Evelyn, and his own increasingly nervous attorney. He still insisted even then that he had never personally ordered Calder to destroy anything, describing him instead as an unstable officer who had acted entirely on his own impulse that morning. Talia placed the Ashford recording on the table between them and pressed play without a word. In the recording, Whitlock could be heard using demeaning language about Talia specifically, stating plainly and coldly that a black woman standing there in plain clothes would never be trusted or believed by anyone inside his department, and instructing his subordinates to deliberately exploit that very prejudice to keep her stuck outside in the hallway for as long as possible. Calder, standing nearby under guard, listened to the confession play out in full and finally understood with a bitterness he couldn't hide that Whitlock had used him as a disposable tool from the very beginning of that morning. Talia explained calmly that beyond this single recording, the investigation now possessed internal messages, complete access logs, and sworn statements from numerous officers throughout the department. Whitlock offered to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency, promising to hand over both Harlan and Ashford without hesitation if it meant reducing his own sentence. Evelyn flatly refused any immediate deal, pointing out firmly that Whitlock could not spend years using the very people under his command as human shields and then simply claim complete innocence for himself once cornered. Talia read the formal arrest order aloud, charging Whitlock with conspiracy to obstruct justice, embezzlement of public property, evidence tampering, and falsifying official government record. Calder was also formally arrested for destroying a federal document, though his later cooperation with investigators would ultimately be noted separately and favorably in his own case file. As he was led in handcuffs past the front counter toward a waiting vehicle, Whitlock was forced to walk directly over the exact spot on the tile floor where the warrant had once been torn apart and scattered. Talia placed the torn pieces of paper, now carefully sealed inside a clear evidence bag, down on that same counter and told him quietly, without any anger in her voice, that he had just tried to destroy the one thing that could have actually proven his innocence, had he ever truly been innocent at all. Several months later, the case finally reached federal court, drawing a courtroom full of reporters, former colleagues, and residents whose property had never been returned. Whitlock's attorney argued forcefully that the entire search had never been legally valid, since the physical warrant itself had been destroyed before the marshals ever entered the building that morning. Evelyn calmly demonstrated to the court that the torn paper had only ever been a certified copy intended for on-site notification purposes, while the true original remained safely on file with the issuing court and had already taken full legal effect hours before Talia ever crossed the threshold of that lobby. Talia herself took the stand and explained her reasoning for entering the building alone first that morning. It minimized the risk of a violent standoff between two armed agencies, gave the department's leadership one final opportunity to cooperate peacefully, and protected the officers who had nothing whatsoever to do with the corruption unfolding around them. Several former officers took the stand during the trial, describing years spent looking away from irregularities they had noticed but never felt safe enough to report, testimony that painted a picture of an entire culture built on fear rather than a single corrupt individual acting alone. One retired patrol officer admitted through tears that she had once seen Harlan pocket cash from a seizure and said nothing, convinced that speaking up would end her career rather than change anything. The jury spent 3 full days reviewing the recovered hard drives, the wire transfer records, and the color-coded ledger pulled from Whitlock's hidden folder, and several jurors later told reporters that the torn warrant sitting inside its evidence bag had been the single image they kept returning to during deliberation. One juror said afterward that the torn paper made the entire case feel less like a stack of financial spreadsheets and more like something she could actually hold in her hands, a single clear moment of arrogance that explained everything else that followed it. The recording from her hidden microphone proved conclusively that Calder had been offered a clear and repeated opportunity to verify her identity through the proper channel, and had deliberately chosen to refuse every single time. The torn fragments of the original warrant became by far the single most powerful piece of physical evidence presented at trial, proving not only that the defendants had engaged in years of systemic corruption, but that they had genuinely believed local authority placed them permanently above the reach of federal law. Whitlock was convicted on every major count. Harlan pleaded guilty shortly afterward and provided investigators with information about several additional embezzlement schemes that had gone completely undetected for years before Talia's team ever arrived. Ashford ultimately lost control of his own company after the board of directors voted to remove him from leadership, and voluntarily turned over the company's complete internal data to federal investigators. Calder received a noticeably reduced sentence in recognition of his cooperation, though he was permanently barred from working anywhere in law enforcement for the remainder of his life. Dozens of old arrest files connected to the department were reopened for careful review in the months that followed, and money and property that had been wrongfully seized over the years were gradually returned to their rightful owners, sometimes with a formal letter of apology attached. One elderly man received back a modest inheritance in cash that had been taken from him during a traffic stop nearly 4 years earlier, money he had long since given up ever seeing again, and he wept openly in the lobby of the rebuilt records office when a clerk finally handed him the envelope. A young mother whose car had been seized without proper cause was reimbursed for the vehicle's full value, along with 2 years of towing fees the department had quietly charged her in the meantime. Stories like these spread through the community faster than any official statement ever could, slowly rebuilding a small measure of trust that had taken years to destroy. Julian Crowe was publicly and openly credited as the quiet, unassuming person whose simple decision to preserve a copy of the truth had ultimately helped bring down the entire scheme from the inside. Talia never once described herself as any kind of hero throughout the process, deflecting praise whenever reporters pushed for a dramatic quote. She insisted instead that the real success of the case came from ordinary people who chose, at real personal risk to themselves, to keep a copy of the truth rather than stay silent and look away. A year later, the Briar Ridge station reopened under a new structure of independent civilian oversight, with fresh leadership brought in from outside the region to avoid any lingering loyalty to the old regime. The evidence room now operated under a strict 2-layer verification system requiring 2 separate signatures for any item to be moved or reclassified, and the camera network was no longer controlled entirely by a single private company with unchecked administrative access. Talia returned to the building one afternoon to speak at a training session organized for a fresh group of newly hired officers, most of them barely out of the academy. In the main hallway, just past the front counter, hung a simple framed replica of the federal envelope that Calder had once torn apart in front of a laughing crowd, and beneath the frame ran a single quiet line. The law does not lose its authority just because someone with power refuses to acknowledge it. A young officer near the back of the room raised a hand and asked Talia whether she had felt any real satisfaction watching Whitlock finally get arrested that morning. She thought about the question for a long moment before answering honestly that the memory she carried most clearly was not the instant the marshals came pouring through the front doors, but rather the quieter moment afterward when officers who had spent years too frightened to speak finally found the courage to step forward and tell the truth out loud, one after another, until the silence that had protected Whitlock for so long simply fell apart entirely on its own weight. She told the room that real change rarely arrived with the sound of a door being kicked in, no matter how satisfying that sound might feel in the moment, and that the harder, slower work always happened afterward, in the quiet decisions made by ordinary people who chose honesty over convenience long after the cameras had gone home. Julian Crowe, who still worked in the same archive on the same modest salary, was invited to speak briefly at the same training session, and he told the new officers that he had never once considered himself brave for what he did, only tired of watching numbers change on a screen that were never supposed to change at all. Calder's name came up only once, mentioned as a cautionary example of how easily loyalty to a badge could be mistaken for loyalty to the truth, and no one in the room seemed inclined to defend him. Talia left the building that afternoon without any fanfare, declining an offer from the new chief to pose for a photograph beside the framed envelope in the hallway, walking out instead through the same front doors she had entered through more than a year earlier. Behind her, the door that Whitlock had once used to control an entire department now stood open in the afternoon light, and for the first time in a long time, nobody standing near it seemed interested in deciding who was allowed to walk through.